So we will now start implementation of the main step in our scenario, the when I register the restaurant, and also the thens. We will do so in the register restaurant steps implementation file, and we will use the code that we have from the tutorial in order to implement 3 steps. In order to create the file, we can use the functionality provided by PyCharm and the behave integration. We create the step definition directly from here, create new file, and we will use the default name, that is the name register restaurant. Okay. So now we can also go directly from here, pressing Command or Control, then clicking. We will replace the default implementation with the code that we just copied. Here, basically what we have is a step that is implementing the iRegister restaurant based on the name that is provided as input. Basically what we do here is we use the context to retrieve the table that is provided as input here, just containing for the moment just a name, just one column and one row. And what we do is for every row in this table, usually we will have just one, but many columns. And when we add more fields apart from the name for every restaurant, basically what we do for every row is to visit the page corresponding to the restaurant create view. Here we are also using the name of the view instead of the URL, so we can change it just in the URL's file and not having any impact on our code. Then once we are in that page, we are looking for a form. We get the first form, and then we just go through all the headings in the input table that we're receiving. For the moment, it's just the name. And for every heading, what we do is to look for an input in the form with the same name than the heading. So in this case, name, and fill it with the content for that row and that same heading. So the name in our input table. So basically the parallelism is that we are using the same heading that the input in the form. And when we have gone through all in the columns, so this might work now with just the name, but later if we also add the address, telephone, or whatever fields describing the restaurant, it will work the same, okay? Just going through all of them. Then when we finish filling all the input fields, we just click the submit button to send this data to create the form, the corresponding restaurant. We also have a step that basically what it does is to check that we are viewing the details page for the restaurant. The expected behavior is that after we create a restaurant, we automatically will redirect the user to a page where we can see a restaurant created by that user with the name the tavern. Okay, to implement that, what we do is the same approach that before. We are going to use the input table to check that that particular restaurant exists into the database and has the proper values for every field. So basically here what we are building is a query going through all for a row, all the headings, getting the corresponding value. So we are restricting, give me all the restaurants from the database, but does that satisfy the set of restrictions that we are placing here? For the moment, it will be just that the name is equal to the tavern, okay? So it's just concatenating all these operators with AND. So all of them should hold, for the moment, just name. So this basically is performing a query to retrieve the restaurant that satisfies all these restrictions. For the moment, just that the name is equal to the tavern. And then we check that we are at the page with the URL equal to the page corresponding to the restaurant, so that we have been redirected to the proper page. And finally, what we do is to check that now into the database there are a defined number of restaurants. We, instead of keeping here one, that is what we have in the corresponding step, we implement it with count as a variable. So we can check for any number of restaurants into the database. For the moment it will be one, so we check that that number that gets input from the step is equal to the number of restaurants that are in the database. So with this, we are implementing all the corresponding steps. So now to being able to actually store the restaurants and retrieve them, we will need that in the My Restaurants application, we have a model that can store these restaurants. So we go to the models file inside the My Restaurants application, and we will paste here the definition of this new model restaurant that extends the model provided by Django. And for the moment, it has just one field based on a string. Max length is 120. That is its name. Whenever we modify our models, we will need to update our database. So the database has the tables that can store this new entity into the database. So basically what we use in this case is the make migrations command provided by Django. Okay, so we make the migrations for our application, that is the application where we have modified the models. This will generate a new migration that basically is the commands that make these changes into the database. And now we can execute them with the command migrate that basically will perform, create the table and add to the table a column that is the name and so on. Okay, so the corresponding changes has been applied to the database. And now what we can do is to add the view that we have specified previously in the steps, this view that will be performing the creation of a new restaurant. As you can see, we are creating it inside a namespace called My Restaurants. This way we can distinguish between the views for different applications. So this view is specific for the My Restaurants application. We will create it into the views file for My Restaurants. But in this case, as we are reusing a predefined view, we don't even need to do that. We can do it directly in the URLs file specific for My Restaurants. It's not created yet, so we can create it. And later we will migrate the specific views when we have to customize them to the views file. But for the moment, we can create it here because we are just reusing the Django views, as you can see. Basically, what we are doing here is to create the restaurant create view with a name, so we can refer to it later by name. It will be listening in this path, okay, inside My Restaurants. And what we are doing also here is to reuse the create view provided by Django. This is a generic view that we can customize to instruct it what kind of entity it should create, in this case a restaurant, where there is the form that can be used to create this kind of entities. and the specific form, the code for that form. Here's the HTML where this form will be loaded. And this case, we're going to use also class forms to create the forms automatically for every entity in our model. So we specify these three parts, and we don't need to customize it further. So we can just keep it here in the URLs file. But the problem now is that this view is just available from the My Restaurants application, but we also need to make it available from the project roots. So in the project roots, that for the moment we just had the account login, account logout in, and the admin application, we will add a new path that corresponds to our My Restaurants application. Okay, we will use the include command here from Django URLs. And basically what we are telling is that from the My Restaurants URLs, we are importing or including and using the namespace My Restaurants to distinguish the views inside this application from other potential views with the same name in other applications. So this will make, through My Restaurants, the corresponding view to creating restaurants available. So it will be My Restaurants, and then continuing here, restaurants create. Okay, the whole path to reach the corresponding view. And basically with this, we have these routes now available for the whole application. Okay, so now continuing with our code, what we have missing in the URLs, as we saw before, is the corresponding form. We need this form to create the restaurant, and we will use model forms also provided by Django to make this really easy. So we will create a new file that will be called forms inside My Restaurant Python file with the name forms. And here we will paste the code available from the tutorial that is creating a new model form called restaurant form that will be capable of creating restaurants. And for the moment, we will not exclude any of the fields. We just have the name, and we want that field to be editable through the form. So we will not exclude any of the fields on the restaurant. And now what we also need, as we saw in the URLs, is to define the corresponding HTML where we will display the form. And now what we would do is create a new templates folder inside, and this will be specific for the My Restaurants application, so we will create it here. And inside, we will create a folder named My Restaurants, because later all the templates are mixed, and we want to distinguish which correspond to every application. So My Restaurants. And inside templates My Restaurants, we will create specific templates for the restaurants application. We will start with an HTML file that is called base.html that we will use as the basic, the fundamental template for all views in our application My Restaurants. The code for this base template is available also from the tutorial, and basically what it does is to create an HTML template where there is a header section. As you can see, there are different parts of the HTML code that are labeled. Okay, so defining like blocks with name that we can later replace. So this is like the basic template, and we can then replace parts of these depending on what we need to do, and the other parts that we want to keep the same to provide an uniform user experience, we can keep them unmodified. So for instance, here we will have a header where we can display if the user is authenticated to display the username and a link to the logout view so the user can log out. And then here next, what we do is to go back to the page from where we clicked the logout, to go to the logout view. We also have, if the user is not authenticated, a login link. As you can see, we are going to the login view that we defined previously. And next, as we saw before, now is basically to go back to the page after going to the login form and typing username and password. We will go back to the page from where we click the login button. We will have a sidebar that basically for the moment is just to go to the home page that will be in my restaurants. And we also will have a content part, the main part of our view, that is basically for the moment just to display error messages, but this is just a placeholder that we can replace later. For instance, we will place here the form that we want to show in order to create a new restaurant, and a footer that for the moment is empty, but we can also customize later. This will correspond to the base template. And now what we want to do is to create the My Restaurants form HTML. This will be a generic template that will be used to show any of the forms in our application, not just to create restaurants, also to create dishes or whatever other entity can be also used for that, because we are using the model forms that make this very generic. What we are going to use here is, we have the base HTML page, view, we can drag the file, and here we will create the form.html. And here, what we will place is the code also from the tutorial that basically what it does is to extend the base template that we defined previously, redefining the block content. So the rest will be kept the same, but we will just change this part. Here we will add a form, the one that we are later looking for from the corresponding step implementation. And inside, basically what we are doing is to display the model form that we will receive from the create view. It will also have a button, the submit button, that we are also looking for from the step implementation. And finally, there's also a protection for security, this CSRF token that we are placing in all forms. This is just to check that the form that we are receiving is the one that we previously generated. That's it. This is for security, to avoid unsecure access to the forms in our application. So with these, we have all the components regarding our newly create view to create restaurants. So now we also define the missing app name in the URLs file for my restaurants. And now we can then, because everything is ready, we can execute again the feature. Instead of with behave from the command line, we will do this from inside PyCharm. So we just execute it, and we can see now that the when I register restaurant step is also being completed. but now is failing in the then I view the details page for restaurant. If we scroll to the bottom, we will see that here the problem is that it's complaining about not having a URL to redirect to. Okay, it's complaining about that when we create the restaurant, as you remember, the idea is that we will be redirected to a page where we are seeing the details for the restaurant that we just created. But right now, we haven't created yet that view to show the details for a restaurant. So that's why it's complaining. This will be the next step in our BDD development.